From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi again, and welcome to the show post-Thanksgiving. Glad to have you back. So, in the end, it all comes down to these words enshrined in the Constitution of the state of Illinois back in 1970. An enforceable contract, the benefits of which shall not be diminished or impaired. To state workers and to retirees, that means pension benefits they've accrued through the years cannot be taken away, but to others, there's a little bit of wiggle room in there. The enforceable contract part maybe means that contracts can be changed sometimes. Who knows? So, pension reform swept across Illinois this week with amazing speed, and it ain't going to stop before it reaches Chicago. You can put that in the bank. Blogger and retired teacher Fred Klonsky is joining us again today. Glad to have you back on the show again, Fred. Fred's been on the ramparts fighting these so-called reforms all the way, and we're just glad to have him back on the show again. Also on the show today, police arrested 182 kids between 10 and 14 years old on gun charges just in 2012. And Pulitzer Prize winner Mark Konkol is here to bring us up to date on the controversy about what to do with kids and guns in Chicago. Great three-part series you did in DNAInfo. Glad to have you back again, Mark. And Marcus Gilmer is leaving us. He's headed out to San Francisco for a big digital job at the Chronicle. For a while now, he's been digital editor at the Chicago Sun-Times and a guest here from time to time on the show. And we're glad to have you back to say farewell to Chicago.
Glad to start my farewell tour here.
Yeah, you traitor. You don't care about Chicago. You don't care. One of the reasons I wanted to have Marcus back on the show is because for the last year or so, his formal portrait on the Sun-Times website was taken right here at this table with the Chicago Newsroom logo on it. I never understood why they let him do that, but hey, there you are. So, welcome back anyway. All right, so we do have a lot of interesting stuff to talk about today, not the least of which is the Wrigley Field deal, which I just find kind of fascinating for a lot of reasons. Maybe we'll talk about that too. But Fred.
Yes.
Fred.
Yes.
You have been blogging about this for a very long time, and it has happened. Were you a little bit surprised by the speed with which the four tops came together and just suddenly came up with a deal?
Is anybody surprised in Illinois when Michael Madigan can put a deal together in less than 6 hours? No, I did lose a bet. I thought actually that Senate President Cullerton, who's been very silent over the last couple of days, including the days leading up to the vote, might not have the votes in the Senate, but when Michael Madigan wants something, it seems like he can get it, and he wanted it now because it would be more difficult after the first 2 years as we get closer to an election. So no, I wasn't surprised. What was difficult over the last couple of days, and I must have visited probably a half a dozen state reps in the last couple of days, along with other members of the IFT and the IAA, and what's truly kind of disappointing is the position of Democratic representatives and senators who, many of them who voted against really what was this same bill back in May. Senate Bill 1 that was passed this week is pretty much looked like Senate Bill 1 back in May when the Senate wouldn't agree to it, and many of the House members didn't agree to it, even though it passed in the House, and knew it was unconstitutional then and suddenly decided that it was constitutional now. I talked to people like Laura Fine up in Deerfield and Michelle Mussman out in Schaumburg, and their main argument is that they've cut, these are Democrats speaking, they've cut all that they can cut from social programs, from poor kids, from schools. They can't cut anymore, and now it's just the retirees that are left that they can get the money from. The notion that they can raise money by going after the corporations are wealthy in the state, they could change the way in which we raise revenue, never seemed to occur to them. It's just a question of who they can cut, and we were what was left. And then the other thing that came up when I had these discussions was that we don't know whether it's constitutional or not. They're kicking the teachers down the road and let the courts decide. But they know very well exactly the language that you said, which is that in 1970, the Constitution was written that said that our pension benefits cannot be diminished or impaired, and that's a contract. And the poison pill on this bill is that for someone like me, who's a second-year retired teacher, who's paid into the pension fund for 30 years, 10% of my salary, no Social Security, that there is no consideration. That's a legal term, meaning that if you give up something in a contract, you can get something of equal or better. Yeah. There is no consideration offered to current retirees in this bill, and it'll go down. It'll go down.
Do you think the Supreme Court's going to?
Well, if the Supreme Court is, some are concerned that the Democrats on the court are also in the pockets of Michael Madigan, and well, we'll see. We'll see whether the law means anything.
Well, I mean, the story did turn. I was a little surprised to see how quickly the story turned from. There's been this victory for the people who wanted these changes to. This has now become an issue for the courts. I mean, it just kind of very quickly moved over to it being a court story. But, you know, Michael Madigan said yesterday that the court might pick and choose. They might say, well, part of it is legal and part of it isn't. And so there may be some horse trading that'll come.
Well, of course, that's for the state's public employee unions have highly paid attorneys. The people who are going to make money off of this are the state's attorneys and the union attorneys. And the thing that will happen if the courts say no is that in 3 years the legislature will have to come back and figure out a way to raise money to pay the state's bills. If the courts decide that this is an unconstitutional bill, which I hope and believe that they will, we'll be back here again. Except the $100 billion liability, $100 billion will now be larger, and people will have to pay more.
Any other thoughts on this?
I want to pick up what you said about the being seen as a victory, and I was thinking about that on the way over. I read several articles about how this was considered a victory for Quinn, how he was able to kind of peel off that label of being a guy who didn't get things done. Yeah, indecisive, and I don't see how this is a win when he's flying in the teeth of these union and labor groups who are such supporters of Democratic candidates who aren't going to go and vote for Rauner or whoever the Republican gubernatorial candidate is next year. I mean, are they just going to abstain? I don't know. Maybe you could help me. But this is flying in the face of a big support group. What are they going to do?
You're exactly right. Not only from the PAC money, but I've gotten almost 30,000 blog visits in the last 3 days, and many comments from teachers outside of Chicago. And what's interesting about it is that pension members, especially teacher pension members, are not concentrated in Chicago or in a university town. They are equally spread out in every legislative district in the state.
Oh my God, there are teachers everywhere.
We are everywhere, and so when you look at when I would get letters from people who are precinct captains from downstate towns who are Democratic campaign workers who write and say, the top of the ticket, I'm not pulling out for the top of the ticket, and I'm not going to pull out any votes for reps who voted for Senate Bill 1. I think the Democrats are in trouble. They thought up until now.
So then you think Bruce Rauner is going to be our next governor?
It's very possible because the Democrats, I think, have lost a significant base, and these are activist Democrats. These are not just voters, and so I think they are. I think this is trouble, and they thought that they could get away over the past period of time of positioning themselves on financial issues just an inch to the left of the Republican Party, really of the Tea Party. They think that they could pass a bill for, say, for example, same-sex marriage, which I was down in Springfield to support as well, and that would be enough, and that they could cut teachers and they can cut 800,000 members of state pension systems, and think that voting yes on a same-sex marriage bill will excuse them from taking a revenue position just to the left of the Republicans, because we would all vote for them because it's the lesser of two evils.
Well, I think that when you get to be Michael Madigan and you get to be the president of the Senate, you think that this is still a blue state. It's still the home of Barack Obama. The Democrats are gonna roll. But one of the things you have to also think about is what Mayor Emanuel miscalculated when he went after the teachers and closed the schools is that what will the backlash be? I haven't seen any. I don't know of any protests planned. And the other thing is that when the state decision is really, when it comes to Chicago police, fire, teachers union, it's really just a precedent. And then there's going to be, the mayor in Chicago is going to be in for a battle again, but this gives him leverage. It says, look what the state's already done. That's why the fire department hasn't pushed through its contract that expired, years ago. That's why nothing's been done in the police department. That's why this hasn't been decided with the teachers union. So when it comes to Chicago, it's coming, and this is what's happened. What's been decided obviously will go to the courts, but I think that it depends on the backlash. I think that the reason Madigan wanted it this year is because he knows that next year it'll become a bigger campaign issue. Right now it's December, slow news. People are on vacation and shopping, and this is the time to do it. So it was strategic, but Illinois still is a Democrat state where people vote, where Democrats vote the Democratic Party, no matter what.
Except in almost all of Illinois. I mean, outside of collar counties.
But what I'm saying is, when it comes down to the popular vote, it has ended up blue.
Yeah.
And that's the trend. Now, when you talked about activist Democrats and Republicans, that's another story. The question is, what will the backlash be?
All I'm saying, listen, Quinn won against a Tea Party Republican by 30,000 votes in the last election.
That was Pat Quinn.
That's Pat Quinn. There's no other Democrat running.
Right, but when he did win, did he have the full support of everyone? I mean, was he co-opted yet? I mean, what was the situation? Obviously, Bill Daley dropped out. Lisa Madigan dropped out. He's apparently has the support of the most powerful Democrats in the state that aren't the governor. So we'll see. I think that's what they're banking on. I think that those are the cards that they're holding, and they're hoping that the flop isn't, mass protests from, all around the city.
Does Madigan have that power, though, that, say, Richard J. had back in the day? When you're talking the 50s, 60s, when, he could deliver Chicago.
I think he has it in the State House, obviously. I mean, it's not the same kind of power as,
But what really bugs me about this is that look at Wisconsin. Okay, I have lots of friends in Wisconsin who just absolutely believed that once they stormed the State House, everything was going to be okay. They couldn't get the recall election, and the body politic of Wisconsin is deeply split, but really more anti-union than pro-union. And I'm wondering if the calculation hasn't been made that Illinois is basically the same way, and that you guys are not as supported as you think you are.
Well, I think, first of all, the poll.
But I think that might be a miscalculation.
Yeah, the polls don't show that.
When you look at what happened with the teachers union, with the strike, with the 90% vote, they thought they had that wrapped up. When you talk about closing all those schools and the big protests and the march, and that was a miscalculation. What I'm saying is they might be wrong, but I think that they're banking on that they're right, and we're going to see. Leading up to the next election. But if they were going to do it, now's the right time to do it.
Well, I do just want to say, Fred, that I think you bring up a really good point about, as you so often do, that's your job, that when you get down into the granular level of the smaller towns in out there in rural Illinois, you still have that same dynamic. You've got, wait a minute, this is the teacher who has been teaching in my school for 30 years, who's retired, and this was a good teacher, and we need to support them. So you might have a level of support there that goes beyond the sort of red-blue politics. It's hard to say.
And just one last thing around this is that I'm not sure what's going to. There doesn't seem to be a challenge to the mayor yet. It's hard to know what might happen in the next 6 to 8 months. But I think over time, I think what will happen in Chicago is what we're seeing, say in Connecticut and in New York, where within the Democratic Party and to the left of the Democratic Party is an emergence of a working families party, of a labor-based party that runs in the Democratic Party, sometimes runs out of it. As a third party in other situations, that may not be the case in this coming November. It's too late in terms of the primary now. But if this attack continues on public employees and on the refusal of the Democrats to confront the revenue issue here with a graduated income tax, for example, and stop giving giveaways to ADM and these other giant corporations, I think. It may be wishful thinking, but I think the emergence of an alternative to this kind of center-right Democratic Party that we have
I
in the
agree.
state.
I think that there's the grassroots movement is there. That there's a lot of people that are like that, but what it needs is a leader, right?
That's right.
And the leader can't come from the grassroots movement. It's got to be someone who co-ops the grassroots movement, because this is Illinois and this is Chicago. And the interesting thing about statewide politics is that there's a new guy coming back to Illinois. And his name is Paul Vallis, and then I'll stop talking about it there. But he's one of those guys who was on the inside and on the outside, and he's with Quinn, who's been on the outside and now is on the inside. And what will happen with them? Will people support him, or will they see, will they see Quinn and Vallis as being co-opted again?
Especially when you start mixing school politics into that.
Exactly, and people care about their schools, and the middle class struggles. Can you continue to live in Chicago when you get as many parking tickets as I do?
Well, Clarence Page actually, I thought, brought up a good point the other day, saying that the post-Obama Democratic Party in many ways might look like the post-Bush Republican Party, and that there is going to be this cleave between the sort of the Republican Democrats and the other Democrats who want to go in a different direction.
But how did that work out for the Republicans?
Well, I'm not taking a position optimistically or otherwise. I'm just saying that split really does feel to me like that split is beginning to develop.
I think that America's like 50-50. We can go either way on a lot of things,
that's exactly right.
So it's like
we're just on this knife edge.
There's a tipping point, and how do people? It's more comfortable to continue to vote for the same people. That's we had Mayor Daley for 23 years, 22 years. It's more comfortable to have that same guy, But the question is, will people revolt?
I want to actually take host prerogative here and hijack this and switch to your series in DNA, Mark, because I thought you raised so many interesting and really provocative points with this, something that I really recommend you check out, DNAInfo Chicago, 3-part series on juveniles and guns. And let's try to put this into some perspective. The mayor and the police superintendent have been hollering for the last 6 months about how we have to change the law so that there are mandatory minimums for the possession of an illegal firearm when you're in the commission of a crime. And a lot of people, and I kind of put myself in this side, have been saying, what does this solve? What does it solve to just take more kids and just put them in the juvenile justice system, put them in prison to make them even worse off than they were? But your story really raised some very provocative issues on the other side, because you kind of look at it from what happens when you have thousands of kids actually who are brought into the system and nothing happens. They just go back out on the street again.
Well, I mean, the mandatory minimum is separate. That's for adults. Nobody's talking about mandatory minimums for juveniles. Juvenile justice is something that is supposed to help kids change before they turn 18. Like 18 is some kind of magic number.
Right.
And I got interested in the topic of juvenile gun crimes mostly because of the whole Chief Keef situation. He's a gang member from Inglewood, and before he was a rap star, he pointed a gun at a cop, and he got house arrest, probation, and I wondered, how could you point a gun at a cop no matter how old you are and just get house arrest, and then be out on probation that can get revoked? I didn't understand that. So I started by gathering court records, or at least court you can't get juvenile court records, but you can get a count of how many juveniles get caught with guns, and it was interesting to see how many of them ended up being punished with incarceration or detention, and 80% of the kids caught with guns don't end up getting charged, and of the guilty, 87% are given probation or supervision, and it was kind of a wonky, boring idea in my head until I met Rodnell Dennis in Old Town. And he was a 13-year-old gangbanger in 1992 who shot at vice lords and hit a 9-year-old boy and killed him. At that time, Cabrini Green was up for grabs. That's the year that the Tribune did their, We're Killing Our Children series. Rodnell got sentenced as an adult to 39 years in prison, and he was out on parole. And he talked to me frankly about everything in his life. And I thought that was the perfect way to explain.
Because he had just gotten out of prison.
Yeah, he just gotten out of prison on parole, and he was working a job in the South Loop and living with his mother or his sister in the West Loop, on the West Side. And, his story illustrates what kids go through who live in these bad neighborhoods, poverty, gangs, broken down family structure. What happened to him? He wanted to belong. He wanted to be the best gangster disciple he could be. He would do anything to gain more power. And he was 11 when he got his first gun. And just the idea that, they physically train them on guns. You have a water gun, you have a cap gun, you use a BB gun to do armed robberies, and you get that first gun, and he talked about the sound that it made. You hear that sound, and he said, it's like having sex for the first time. You always want to hear that sound. It makes you feel powerful. People fear you, and he was 13 when he killed the kid. And who knows what he did before that with that gun that he didn't get caught doing. But he told me, he's like, vice lords were like target practice. They would come, we would shoot, or we would go over there, provoke them, and shoot. And it's still happening. And when I talked to McCarthy, Superintendent McCarthy, he said, this is one of the things I've thought about for 10 years and I don't have a solution for. When I talked to Anita Alvarez, she said, I don't know if locking kids up is the answer. And it just kind of sits there. Like, we throw our hands up. What do we do? So, if we're going to have a culture change with shootings in Chicago, the only way to do that is to start with the kids.
But Judge Michael Tooman from the juvenile courts told you that, I guess I wasn't really aware of this, that by law, judges are essentially, not ordered,
the juvenile justice law from the 80s says that you're supposed to give the least restrictive sentence to juveniles, no matter what.
Right.
And carrying,
which makes sense. You can understand the impulse to.
And carrying a gun isn't the same thing as shooting a gun or hitting somebody with. So it's you have a gun. It's not really violent yet. But as Superintendent McCarthy explained, having a gun is a precursor to killing someone.
Shooting someone,
right? And so when we're living in Chicago in an urban setting, how do we marry the two so that it makes sense?
Right.
And last week I talked to Illinois Supreme Court Justice Ann Burke, who said, this is something where there needs to be changes. We need to study the statistics better. We need to come up with a way to help these kids, to provide more programs, because federal funding and state funding for these kind of things isn't there anymore. And when I talked to the University of Chicago Crime Commission Executive Director Rosanna Ander, she said there's no political will. There's a lot of finger pointing, and these are the kind of things that when you're living in Chicago, in the national, besides the pensions, the biggest thing the country knows about Chicago is that we're killing each other.
Right.
This is one of the big things that needs to be discussed.
And it's really, I hate to sort of try to tie these two together, but it's so similar in a way to the whole mess with the pensions, this whole thing about political will. What's needed is for someone to take really extreme leadership and say, wait a minute, there are certain things that we have to do here. But the political expedience is always to vote in favor of less crime, right? Whatever comes up.
But when you talk about big time leadership, that's easy to say and hard to do. That's what Rahm Emanuel thinks he's doing with the schools. I'm going to take extreme leadership, and when he's getting big blowback, like I'm going to try to save the kids. That's his message. And he gets big blowback from teachers, the middle class, people living in poor communities who just want it's hard enough to go through day to day, but have to send their kid across gang lines is another problem. How are you going to do that? You need it to be an intellectual decision. Like, we know that in Cook County this happens, and we need to have laws so we can help these kids so they don't go down this road.
I guess.
Well, I was going to say, I think here's where I think you're right about the comparison, and that is that the response of really the politically and socially lazy legislators is that in the face of a crisis, it's better to do something than nothing. Mm-hmm. And doing something rather than nothing has gotten us into lots of, it got us into Vietnam, it got us into Iraq, it got us into Afghanistan. Doing something is better than nothing mm-hmm. is not really an intellectually smart thing to do. I think studying the situation is right, but doing drastic or dramatic measures like Ron did with the schools, that's not what the blowback was about. The blowback was about the content, the substance of what he did. Not that he did something dramatic, but what that thing was that he did.
Well, it affected these schools and communities that are already so impoverished.
That's right.
And that's what I liked about your series is that it dovetailed a lot with what a series WBEZ had done either last year or maybe 2 years ago on the juvenile justice system, and then something, this topic Steve Bajir at the Reader has been writing about a lot, about poverty, especially in relation to the schools and these new school closures. And there's this root that's been there, 100 years? Maybe 100 years? I mean,
nobody who's ever has to get elected for their job has the guts to say the truth is these places are failing. Mm-hmm. And we need to clear them out so that we can build something new. Isn't that what's happening? I mean, if you drive around some of the neighborhoods around my house, if you see vacant houses with red X's. The schools are closed. What's next, right? Or there's no public transportation. You go down Inglewood on 63rd Street, and it's mm-hmm. a prairie again. Mm-hmm. And now there'll be a Whole Foods. So what are we trying to accomplish? And you can't say those kind of things because people live there. Mm-hmm. But how do you save areas that are overrun with gangs, that are stricken with poverty? What do you do? That's a big question, and people in leadership have to answer for that.
Yeah.
And it's just like the pension issue. We didn't pay the pension. The state and the city didn't pay into the pension fund. They took pension holidays through the 90s.
Well, that's what I'm talking about.
When we were making all kinds of, when
what
the
about
economy
TIF
was
funds?
booming.
Can you rebuild the infrastructure with TIF funds rather than build a new DePaul arena?
Well, okay. See, you're leaving town, aren't you?
Yeah.
Take a last parting shot on my way out.
Yeah, right.
It's easy that way.
I think you should get some more in.
We got about 30 seconds left, and I'm sorry to say this.
Yeah, right.
This was our parting gift to you. We're not letting it.
And I'm letting my parting shot go.
What do you have to say to Chicago in your last 30 seconds on your way out the door?
Believe it or not, I'm going to miss this city and its people and its culture something fierce. It's been an amazing city, and it's a supportive community, especially in journalism. You can never work with someone, but you can still know their work and respect them. And it's just an amazingly supportive community in journalism and just the city's culture as a whole.
But can we expect Twitter pot shots from you still? Because
Chicago?
No, so we can enjoy them.
Yeah.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we'll let these guys continue because they'll have plenty to talk about. We got to go. This is Chicago Newsroom. Thank you so much to Marcus and Mark and Fred for being here today. We're over time as always. I'm Ken Davis. You're watching Chicago Newsroom. Watch us at this address right here. You can see us anytime you want, and we'll see you next week back right here on CAN TV. Thanks. Bye.